But let me introduce our guest to us, Paul Kerensa. This is according to Wikipedia, which we always know is correct. Paul Kerensa is a comedy writer and stand-up comedian. He wrote and briefly appeared in the television series Miranda. He was a co-writer of television series Not Going Out, as various other things as well. And I know this to be true. He appears regularly on Pause for Thought on Radio 2. And Paul's also the author of a number of different books. Welcome, Paul. It's really good to have you with us. Paul has his books with him.
Always on standby. You never know when they're needed. Absolutely. Good evening. Thanks for having us. I say us, it's just me, but it sounds better when it's us. Absolutely. You can pretend there's a team behind you, can you? So, good evening.
Where are you joining us from this evening, Paul?
Broadcasting live from Guildford in Surrey, but very envious of where you are. So one day.
One day. Well, I'll come to that in a minute. I've known Paul for a little while. We've done a couple of different things together. I was trying to work out, I think it was back in about 2013, Paul came and compared a comedy night at the Recreate Festival that I was involved with setting up in its earliest days, which has gone on to all kinds of things since then. But Paul was with us in the very early days. And also you came and did comedians and carols at the church that I was at, a couple of parishes.
It's either midsummer or Christmas, I think, isn't it? It's very hot, very cold, one or the other. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I know obviously this is one of your favourite gigs you're going to have ever done, but you've got a really big one coming up, which I didn't know about until last week, when I had an email from the Bishop's office in the Diocese of Salisbury that you're playing, if that's the correct word, to the clergy conference of the Diocese of Salisbury to an X amount of hundreds of clergy in a couple of months' time.
Yeah, and I'm quickly looking at the diary now. That might be actually my next gig, my first in-person event. So I'm not saying I'll be rusty or anything, but I mean Zoom gigs have been great in the last year to keep us going. But no, I had 3 gigs. Normally I do 2 or 3 gigs a week on the circuit or in churches and events for church festivals and things. But yeah, 2 or 3 a week normally. Last year it was 3 in the whole year, really, from February till now. Where are we now? We're now in May. So and that may be my first gig back. So
wow.
Yeah.
Well, if you can't picture where we're coming to you from, but basically we're about 2 or 3 miles, most of us, from where that gig will take place. So you'll be close by. But like I say, thanks for joining us. But let's maybe just to sort of set the scene and a bit of groundwork. How did you get into comedy, into the business of comedy, which probably, as you've mentioned, doesn't really seem like much of a business or a challenging one, particularly over the last year?
Yeah, well, it was never the plan. I think comedy is never really anyone's. Actually, no, that's not true. When I started, there wasn't really a comedy industry kind of route in. There was no one's plan A, I think. Although nowadays, I've found more and more the younger generation of comedians do arrive having done a degree course in stand-up comedy or with a 5-year plan, and you meet them on the circuit and they'll say, yeah, I've been going for 6 months.
Here's Paul.
Now, that is something that doesn't happen at live gigs normally.
Absolutely.
You're halfway through a sentence and suddenly, your mouth fails you. Apologies for that. We've paid for the fibre optic super mega broadband, and months in, and who knows what's happening here. I heard you talk earlier about rural broadband, and here we are in Guildford, which is rural enough, clearly, to have the dodgy broadband. Apologies.
That's all right. No, we were. I think we got about as far as it wasn't Plan A.
It wasn't. None of this is clearly Plan A.
I mean, my follow-up question was going to be how have you had to innovate during the last year? And then you disappeared.
Well, do you know what happened? In fact, so the Wi-Fi clearly went. I moved the laptop then across from to plug into the Ethernet thing, and even that wasn't working. So we're now on the 4G. This is now operated entirely via the mobile signal,
okay.
Which is clearly stronger, hopefully stronger. If that goes, I'm just going to come to all of your houses and just answer questions individually. So that's the plan. That's Plan B. Meanwhile, anyway, I don't know how far I got into that question before it cut out, but essentially, yeah, I did a theology degree, not vocationally, not to become a priest as such, but I was interested in it. I'd been a Christian since I was a middle teenager, I suppose, and I was interested in religious studies at school, and I thought, yeah, I can see myself examining this further for 3 years and still have questions, academic sort of questions. But at the end of that 3 years, I thought, I don't know if the ministry's calling. Am I an RE teacher now? Where do I fit in? But I discovered theatre at university and loved it, and loved performing in plays, particularly comic plays. I enjoyed writing comic plays, and I enjoyed watching stand-up. And I'd never thought of uniting those three things into doing stand-up until the end of, I did a 1-year drama school course, and at the end of the drama school thing, they sit you down, they say, just so you know, half of you at least will never get on stage again statistically, but thanks for the money, off you go. And they say, but anything you can do that's unusual, put on your CV, because you never know what might get you that job. So if you can roller skate, sing, dance, speak French, whatever it might be, clean driving license. And I didn't have any of those things, so I panicked a bit. And then I had a week of sort of morose plodding around going, what do I do with my life? And I saw an advert, if this were a film, you see a flyer, blown down the street in the wind, and you grab it and go, stand-up comedy evening class. Let's give this a go. And I did it once and just loved it. I thought, this is it. Now, once the thing arrives that you know that this is it, and I just loved it. And that was 20 years ago this year. So and it had all the ups and downs. It's not like you arrive fully formed as a stand-up. You have good gigs, bad gigs, especially those first 10, the first 100 gigs. They always say you're going to get a complete mix of everything in there. And just when you think you've seen it all, there's a global pandemic and every comedy show is suddenly illegal and moves online, and with cutouts and dropouts and everything like that. So here we are, 2 decades on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was saying I think I've been to a couple of comedy gigs over the last year, sort of on Zoom by a few people. How have you found that experience? That must be.
It's not. It's odd saying this to a Zoom audience. It's not fun. I mean, it's trickier. I mean, it is fun. It's great. It's the best we can do, isn't it? And I think in the same way that I'm sure many of you have done, I don't know, a Zoom quiz or Zoom family get-togethers for Christmas, whatever it might be. It's not the ideal, is it? But if that's the best we got for now, then we'll take it. I'm just glad that this pandemic's come along now and not 15, 20 years ago when it was all dial-up internet and cassettes instead. There was no Netflix and it was all those things. So technology at the minute, there's something we can grab in that. But yeah, I've not done, like I said, normally I do a couple of gigs a week in person in back in the old days. In the last year, I've done a weekly Facebook live show, which I'm now doing actually on Monday lunchtimes, every Monday at 12:30 on my Facebook page. You're more than welcome. It's free, just long if you like. And it's half an hour. And it's just really a nice little community and connection and getting together and all that sort of thing, joining in with the chat, bit of interactive stuff. I think that's what I found is, some venues or some churches or festivals in the last year have said, can you do a comedy show pre-recorded? And I've done a show for them pre-recorded. Others have said, can you do it live streamed, Zoom or YouTube with comments and things. And I always like that, the live thing, when people are there live. And I know that, Lewis, at the start, you encourage people, think of questions, don't be shy. And I urge you for that. Don't be shy. Absolutely. Just lob them out when the time's right, because that interactive nature it means you're just part of a conversation. Whereas I've done shows where I've literally had my phone up and recorded me for an hour doing jokes or half an hour, whatever it might be. And you just feel like you go mad halfway through that. You think this is not the reason that I got into stand-up. But at the same time, of course, the dream of many comedians is to get onto TV and the like. And I've done comedy. I've done shows for TV with that, except it's just a bigger camera and with the cameraman behind it and a studio. So in essence, what we've done is we've just converted the whole world into a TV studio. And here we are broadcasting ourselves, in theory across the world, in practice across corners of Dorset. But the possibilities are there anyway.
Absolutely. Because you're saying, over the course of your career. You must have done thousands of gigs of various sizes and styles. I was thinking, I guess, I guess as a church leader, we've all had terrible experiences in certain services. I wonder if what's your worst gig that you've ever had? I mean, bearing in mind we're only part way into this one.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, it's early days. Yeah, early days. Yeah. Everyone, the thing is, everyone wants to know about the worst gig, but equally, that's the one that does stick in the mind. You know, and yeah, in fact, I worked it out recently. I think it's about 3,000 gigs. I think I've done something like that. I did actually count for the first 1,000, and I found a file recently on my computer logging all of those on like an Excel spreadsheet with a star rating out of 5, how I think I did, who I was on with, and you can go back and say, oh yeah, gig number 12 was Harry Hill, and and all that sort of thing, and how much I got paid at each gig, and what set length I did, and all those sorts of factors, so I could see how it was for the first 1,000. I stopped doing it after the first 1,000, but yeah, buried in there early on, I think it was gig number 65-ish, was the worst gig I've ever had. Thankfully, it was followed by gig number 66, so I kept going. You could stop there. But no, it was a club in fact, I did this as a pause for thought recently. I thought, let's turn this into something inspirational if you can. It was a club in Balham in southwest London, and it's a lovely gig. But I did an open spot there. So you have two sorts of open mic slots in the comedy circuit. You have venues which are just open mic that anyone can turn up. You do 5 minutes, and it's a complete mixed bag of quality. And then you have professional gigs where there's an open mic slot where you'll do 5 minutes, but if you go well, you then progress to the 10-minute slot and then the 20-minute slot. And this was one of those. And I'd done my 5 minutes, I'd done my 10 minutes. They said, come back and do 20. So I did my first ever 20-minute paid professional proper slot there. And that went well. And a week later, they had a cancellation. So they phoned me up and said, look, we're desperate. This other act's not made it. Are you free? I went, yeah, I'm free. I'm down the road. Let's do it. But of course, I was only there a week before doing the exact same 20-minute set. And the audience are regulars. And a couple of guys in the front row had seen me only less than 7 days previously. And they were yelling out all my punchlines before I could get to them. They would go, oh, this is the bit he does when the Churchill dog, oh yeah, whatever it might be. And it was tricky trying to actually get any laughs when every joke I started, they would finish before I could reach it. And nowadays I've got enough material that I could just go, okay, let's retire that 20 minutes and do a different 20 minutes. But back then I didn't have anything else. That was all I had. So, and there was the worst thing is, and expanding this beyond comedy, I suppose, which is the pause for thought I tried to find in it was that even when they're booing, that's okay. It's not nice, but at least they were listening. Whereas this lot weren't booing. They were worse than that. They were just ignoring me, because after about 5 minutes, you could hear this slow wave of chat from the back of the room until about 8 minutes in. The entire room was just this chit chat you can hear from like a loud wedding reception. And that's worse, because I had to just stand there with my microphone. Don't know why I'm miming a pen microphone, have a microphone here. And I was here I had to do my time to get paid. I just stood there for 20 minutes and told my jokes to literally just the two guys down the front who were still having the time of their lives, finishing my punchlines for me. And that was the worst of it. But about 10 years after that, at Heathrow Airport, this guy bumped into me and he said, are you a comedian? I went, yeah, I finally made it. Someone spotted me. He said, you wouldn't remember me, but about 10 years ago, I was at this gig in Balham, and me and my mate, we yelled out a few punchlines of yours, and you wouldn't remember it. I thought, you've haunted my dreams for the last 10 years. Here you are again to bring some closure to that particular episode, but there we
are. So you've already mentioned you studied theology, you're a Christian, but what's it like being a Christian in this kind of the stand-up comedy world? I know there's a few knocking around, and we've probably employed them at various times at Recreate, but there's also within that world a lot of quite well-known, outspoken atheists who are sometimes less than kind in their response to Christianity. I just wondered what your sort of reflections of sort of working and existing in that kind of world are.
Yeah, it's up and down, really. I think, and mostly actually, most of the comedy circuit, I find they are lovely, and of every creed and lack of them. I know many atheist comedians, agnostic comedians and you do lots of certainly to begin with, I was doing lots of car shares up and down the country, and it's a 20-minute gig in Hull, but accompanied with that, you have a 10-hour car journey, you know, with the other acts, with one of the other acts. And yeah, I've had loads of great conversations with comedians who would say, oh yeah, you know, they find out that I'm a Christian, and or they knew it already, and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm not, I don't really go in for that, but yeah, as a kid I used to go along to church and we were quite heavily involved, and why did I stop going? And they start to think about it for the first time in a decade or two, you know. And so, you know, most of them very open to these things, and especially because stand-up comedy is in theory, I suppose, to put it grandly, some see it's the last bastion of free speech and all that sort of thing. But and certainly more recently, you have more Muslim comedians, Hindu comedians, Jewish comedians, and indeed Christian comedians. But I think in the past, maybe we felt like it was the Christian comedians versus the atheist comedians. Nowadays, there's a much more mixed bag, I think, of different voices, opinions, backgrounds, cultures. And I think so, therefore, I think we are listening to each other a bit more, which is no bad thing. And I certainly found that that sort of staunch atheism, but particularly actually anti-theism, that you got with, say, Ricky Gervais, for example. I know he's got quite some severe opinions about it, and a few other comedians, but not many. Yeah, there was a bit more of that maybe 10 years ago, I would say. And certainly in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I've found more and more big headline comedians, the ones who were there in the 90s and the noughties for the laddish kind of jongleurs, stag and Hindu style of comedy. More and more of them are saying, actually, they're finding audiences just want nicer comedy nowadays. They don't want, they used to think there's a stereotype of the stand-up circuit being all 18 plus and X-rated. But I think increasingly, maybe it's, I know one of them put it down to the Michael McIntyre effect, that, you know, stand up on TV nowadays is seen, I think, potentially a bit more family friendly. It's not entirely, of course, but there are more family friendly comedians than there were, you know, certainly when I was growing up. It was stand up had to sit sort of late night, Saturday night, BBC Two, Channel 4 kind of thing. And it was a lot edgier maybe. But, and there are still certain comedians who are seeking the edge of things, but I think if you've got an edge, you've got to have a middle ground as well. And a lot of audiences just want laughs. They just want fun and funny. They don't necessarily want the edge, you know, pushing the edge of it the whole time. They just want to laugh, especially now more than ever. You know, we need a bit of cheering up, I think. So in that sense, I think it's a friendlier place maybe than it was 10 years ago for the believer.
Sure. We've talked a bit about your kind of part of your world in terms of stand-up, but also you do a lot of writing and have done a lot of writing for TV and for radio. I just wonder, I find it fascinating. I just how some of these programs, such as Miranda or Not Going Out, how the writing process operates for something like that. Stevens asks, have you ever done character comedy? But I guess within these, you're creating comedic characters that have a funny edge to them.
Well, it's a good question. In fact, I tried character comedy once early on, 15 years ago now probably, and I tried because I had lots of just one-liners, like Tim Vine, Milton Jones style one-liners, but I could never get them to work with my persona. I just found every time I did a one-liner, it just got a groan. Oh yeah. Whereas, you know, it's part of that whole thing is having the right persona and the attitude. And you know, Tim Vine has that really jolly, gleeful thing. Like, it's like, yeah, I've got 1,000 of these, and you're going to listen to him. You know, Milton's a bit more surreal, like your crazy uncle. Jimmy Carr does it all with a darker edge, you know. But they're all really just one-liner comedians, and I couldn't find a way to make it work myself. So I tried being a kind of deadpan Australian character act that, and I don't know. I tried it for a few gigs, but I kept breaking character. I couldn't stop me coming out of it the whole time. So that didn't work very long. That was that anyway. Yeah, in terms of the process for the thing, now I didn't know you were going to ask this, but I like being surprised by questions. So this is a good thing. But as I speak, I'm grabbing, I've got I'm not going to do the entire PowerPoint presentation, but it might be interesting to just see. I've got Not Going Out. When we first started Not Going Out, the Lee Mack sitcom, you know, about 12, 14 years ago now, we would meet up in a room and do it. Nowadays, we do it all sort of online, or, you know, just from home remotely. But in the olden days, I think I can do a little screen share. Is that all right? Should we see if we can do it? Oh no, we can't do a screen share.
You
Doesn't
might
matter.
have to, yeah.
Don't worry, forget that. Anyway, if I were to imagine, oh, it says I can. I can. Here we go. Right, here we go. Right, I'm going to do it again. Here we go. Right, you should see a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Right, I'm going to zoom in on this one here, so you can see this was the wall of sitcom writing, of not going out. And if you can see there, you can see that this was called the stress episode up there in the top left. And each of these post-it notes is like scenes 1 to 13, which is generally about how many scenes you have an episode now, Lee Mack's sitcom. And so each scene, you know, that's scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and so on. The pink post-it notes are Lee Mack's characters' plot points. The yellow post-it notes were Kate, which was the female lead in season 1. Then it was replaced by a character called Lucy. And then Tim Vine, who was in it to start with, he was the orange post-it notes. So lots of shuffling around of those things. It was me and Andrew Collins, who's the film editor of the Radio Times. He was one of the writers too. And that's me as a very young man. And that's Lee reclining there with a big schedule on the wall of all the dates we've got to hit and the episodes we're ticking them off as we've done them. So on there, you can see we've got an episode on the top of the wall and a different episode down below there. So anyway, that's that. So that is, you know, it's like you're planning a heist. You know, it's sort of, you've got this wall of stuff that stays up there for several months, really. And yeah, it takes a good sort of 4 to 6 weeks to write each episode, generally speaking. And nowadays, we actually do it a bit more, like I say, working remotely. Lee writes most of the episodes himself with one other writing partner. And I do most of the sort of gagging up, so writing just the jokes here and there, really. Not all of them. Lee does lots himself, of course. But in terms of the plotting, Lee does most of the plotting nowadays, and I come in and just do a little sheen of a gag pass. And similar with Miranda, she writes the most of it when she's doing it. And there's a few more gaps with Miranda. Lots of whole scene needs to be written. You know, roughly from her, it's got to start here and end there. Have at it, see what you can do, and then lots of back and forth. And it's all good fun, and especially things like Miranda, and in fact not going out as well. Quite a lot of Christians in the process. So Miranda is a Christian. Sally Phillips, who was in Miranda, is a Christian as well. 3 of the 5 main writers in it were Christians. The producer was, and you know, when I started out, you feel like a bit of a dot in this industry, like it's just one of you. As soon as you meet another, there's a line. You meet 3 of them, it's a triangle, the strongest of shapes. And just the more people, whatever industry you're in, you know, it's just always nice to know. Well, I imagine in your industry, Lewis, you probably have got a few Christians there giving you work for the church. But you know, not every industry, they're not quite as visible all the time, and certainly in the media, they're not quite as visible as that. So, but you know, generally speaking, we're all trying to make, you know, entertainment, and that's a nice thing to be doing. Some people have said, you know, not going out some episodes can be a bit late night and a bit X-rated. But some people I think have rightly said, well, you know, should you be do you want to be doing that sort of thing, and doing post-watershed things that's quite so extreme? To which I kind of think, well, if I weren't involved, you should see how X-rated it would be then, you know. So I'm trying to rein Lee in, you know, and in that sense, I think it's better to be part of the conversation and part of the culture than not, and let it run away with itself, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of gone where I was going to ask. I was wondering whether there's been times or experiences in perhaps not just those programs, but other things, whether there's been times you thought, actually, I feel uncomfortable about going there, about writing around this, about the direction. Yeah, have you ever found yourself in that sort of place?
So occasionally, but rarely, I think, and that's partly because the shows I end up writing for, you know, you kind of play to your strengths a bit, I think, and I like mainstream stuff. You know, I enjoy watching more sort of, I don't know, late night Channel 4 sitcoms now and then as well. But I've never been a Frankie Boyle kind of guy. I've never been on his wish list of writers, as far as I'm aware. And but you know, in terms of mainstream sitcom, yeah, enjoy those. You know, so you know, and studio audience sitcom is something a bit lacking lately. We haven't got many of them, but I was very pleased to be writing in fact, for a while, it was the only 2 we had in the country, Miranda not going out at the same time, was that. And generally speaking, the writing for that, they are quite broad, by which I don't just mean pratfalls and everything, but you are catering to a broad audience. If you're doing a BBC One sitcom, a producer I worked with years ago now said, you know, if you can broadcast for your gran, then you've nailed it. You know, if you can write a thing that's enjoyed by, you know, 3 generations of audience, and they can all sit around together and enjoy it, then you've cracked it. You've got a hit, you know. So in that sense, you do have to be fairly broad. So sometimes I try and I mean, most of the time it doesn't come up, but occasionally I did a bit of gagging up and script editing of a few sitcoms, not so much lately. What it was basically was a guy it's all about getting to know producers in this business, really. And there's a comedy producer I used to know fairly well, who was making lots of new comedies for BBC Three, you know, with quite more youth skewed. And I stopped working for him particularly because he got promoted so much. He's now the head of comedy at Sky, which is a great person to know, but unfortunately he's no longer making shows. He's now deciding what shows should be made. So he doesn't get in touch with any work anymore, unfortunately. He's been promoted too far for my liking. He's no longer useful for me, but he would often send me scripts of that he said, we like, this is a script in development, we've got this writer, he's written this script, he's got the voice of youth, he's 15 or whatever, but it's not kind of, you know, needs a bit of a punch up. And I would look through, and you'd sometimes find that they a new writer especially, I think they want their characters to go, obviously in a sitcom, one producer I remember described it as you want to chase your characters up a tree and throw stones at them. You know, you want to make them suffer in that half hour, and of course make them solve it, paint themselves into a corner, save the day somehow. And you want your characters exasperated and exclaiming and frustrated at the end of their tether. So you know, a lot of people therefore have your characters exclaim, expleat, swear, etc. But rather than say the F word or the S word, because of this sitcom was meant to be for an early-ish sort of audience, they couldn't say those because there's a big list at the BBC. Someone says you can't say the F word before 9 o'clock, whatever. So instead, they'd be using more religious kind of swear words, you know, God and Jesus and Christ, and words that, you know, I personally would rather use and hear the F word than have, you know, be talking about the Savior in those sorts of terms, you know. And I think that's probably true of many Christians. I don't know. So I had an issue then, because my dilemma was, do I kick up a fuss and do I say, well, you're using the name Christ as an expletive in here quite a lot. I don't want this. But then I thought, if I do that, then they may just, you know, the next time they'll find a way to exclude me from the process. They'll use someone else. But then you think, I'm not just wanting to save my own bacon here, you know, how do I make a difference? So generally what I would do is zoom in on those lines and try and replace them with kind of better, funny lines. Because not only religiously, but comedically as well, I think it's a lazy shorthand to be, you know, because if you look at things like Blackadder and Faulty Towers, I don't recall a single swear word particularly, or anyone talking about God or Jesus or Christ in any sort of expletive terms. You know, when Basil had to exclaim in that way, he hit a car with a bit of tree, or you know, Blackadder would come up with some brilliantly pithy line against Baldrick or something. And I thought, that's how you do it. You try and be funny rather than just show your characters annoyed and therefore effing and blinding, you know. So generally speaking, I've tried to, you know, jokes I think have hopefully been the thing to save the day in that sense. But that's a minor thing. I mean, you know, is it arguably minor? But that's about a language situation, maybe rather than a subject matter. But generally speaking, like I say, I've been working in mainstream comedy where it's not Frankie Boyle late night kind of stuff. It's mostly nicer, safe. And I've started doing more children's writing now, writing for CBBC sitcoms, and that's lovely because it's for kids. And I've got kids myself. I write the script, I show it to them, go, would this work? And they go, yeah, maybe, or think of something better, and I have to credit them, you know, pay them extra pocket money.
Absolutely. We'll come to Peter's question in a moment. But one of the things we're particularly exploring in these conversations over this month of May, is what some people call or see as a divide between the sacred and the secular. They're saying, well, God's kind of in the sacred stuff, and then there's the secular stuff, and never the twain shall meet. And I guess your environment probably challenges some of that, or brings you into conversation around those ideas anyway. I wonder how perhaps you've experienced the way God's at work in surprising places where people say, well, God shouldn't be working there. God does the sacred thing in hymns and church buildings and such, but how God's present within the comedy world.
Yeah, it's well, in fact, it's, I mean, more and more I'm doing comedy things still, of course, but my interests also lie further than, I've got a drama script that's being optioned at the minute and is being toured around TV channels, which I'd love to write, and documentary things. And so I really enjoy broadcasting and making things for TV and radio. And it's a big area at the minute about the divide between sacred and secular, I think, because there is that argument. There was a Radio Times column about it, I think, a couple of weeks ago for Easter, from one of the bishops saying the BBC is claimed to be having, this is their biggest Easter ever in terms of religious broadcasting. But actually what they've done is they've got songs of praise is 10 minutes longer. There's an Easter service or two. And there's a few late night talks about being Christian, being Jewish, being Muslim, being Hindu. But A, they are shoved right at midnight. And B, they are kind of like religion 101 sort of things, like what is a Hindu, which is educational and interesting. But there was a talk a while ago, there's a study about should TV and radio shows have more religion through their DNA of other shows, having plot lines in EastEnders and Coronation Street that deal with some of the issues that face religious people today of all faiths, And there was a big study at the BBC that said, yeah, we want to do more of this. And the Director General downwards was saying, this is a thing we're going to try and do. But I remember at the time I emailed a radio producer I know, and I've been trying to pitch stuff with and to for years now. And I had a sitcom about a vicar years ago that I tried to make, and they said, oh, Vicar of Dibley was just too recent, give it a couple of years. And 6 months later, Rev appeared, the sitcom Rev. I missed the window, missed the stained glass window. So I emailed this radio producer and said, well, I read this report that, the BBC are looking to do more religion through everything rather than just kind of, pigeonhole it in songs of praise. And he said, oh, I'll check with the boss. And he checked with the radio comedy boss and he said, yeah, we're not really going to do that, but it's a nice idea of the Director General's. I thought it's a shame, it's a missed opportunity. They had an idea of a new vision of way of doing things. But I'm consistently and persistently probably annoying producers with this sort of thing. And in fact, today I've been pitching lately to Radio 4 Comedy, and it's got over the first hurdle, a sort of religious talk show, I suppose, a bit like there's a show called The Infinite Monkey Cage on Radio 4, which is about a science panel show, really funny science panel show. So I'm trying to do the same for religion, where I would, in theory, I've pitched myself to host it. Yeah, right, that won't never happen. But with maybe a Jewish panelist, a Muslim panelist, another Christian panelist, maybe, and we can just talk about some of the issues today that are not in a songs of praise. I mean, I love songs of praise, don't get me wrong. I know some of the guys who make it and they do a great thing, but something that's a bit more about the issues facing people of faith today and some of the dilemmas you have in the modern world, whether it's dating or the workplace or whatever it might be, technology, who knows, online church, does that work? Can you do an online baptism? I was reading today that some people have been doing Zoom baptisms in the last year. You think that the laptop's just going to get wet. Don't know how that works, but but talking about religion, I suppose, in a way that's not, as you said, dividing the sacred and the secular so much, but it's as Christians, personally speaking anyway, I'm a Christian, but I'm also a human. And I was reading the other day about like humanism. Of course, we often see humanism, and indeed modern day humanism often is rather anti-religious in a way for many humanists, I think, or seen as an alternative to religion in any case. But the origins of humanism come in Christianity in a way. It's Christians going, look, we see it as our mission to deal well with other human people, and we want to be good Christians and be who God wants us to be with other people, and not condemning them the whole time. That's, but actually loving them, be working with them. And in the last year, you can see the great stuff that churches have done across the country. That heartbreaking news footage of the church up in Manchester, getting food to people who haven't got any other food or hope or that sort of thing. And I just think, the human side of the church is what I often see, but it's not what the media is often seeing or talking about. And you still, to this day, I wrote for a sitcom years ago now, where they needed a scene in a church, as you often get in sitcoms. It was, I don't know, a baptism, a wedding, a funeral, I don't know, some sort of church scene. And I got to write that scene. So I was writing it, and I thought, let's have a break from the centuries old, church, Dibley in the county of Midsummer kind of church. So I wrote it as a modern build kind of Baptist church, white walls and all that sort of thing.
Sure.
And the second draft came back to me, and it had been changed to an 800-year-old Anglican church, which, to be honest, I go to myself, so I have no problem with that. But I thought,
I was going to say, we've got a few of those.
Got a few of them, exactly. You've got a lovely Benefice. But it's the only church you generally see on TV. Certainly in fiction. In documentaries, maybe slightly different, but in fiction, you only ever see a kind of a Rowan Atkinson style vicar, or Dawn French, maybe if you're lucky, in pillars and 800-year-old buildings. So, but it was changed back in the second draft of this script, and I said, "Why have you changed it? I've put a new type of church on screen." And they said, "Yeah, but it's shorthand, isn't it? If we put that church you've described onto the screen, we need to spend 20 seconds explaining to the audience that this is a church, because they'll go, is that a church? Doesn't look like a church I've been to." Whereas if we just show the pillars and incense and cassocks and robes and things, and a vicar saying "thou shalt not," then the audience instantly go, "Oh yeah, I get this. I've seen this before. I know where we are." And then you can move on with the plot and the jokes and everything. So it's an ongoing, kind of battle in a way to sort of, and that's a lovely side of church. Like I said, I go to a church like that myself. It's great, but as Christians, I think we're so much more than TV and radio would often portray us, maybe. So it's just making it part of the conversation, I suppose, is what I'm trying to do. Ongoing journey.
And I guess one way in which you're able to have quite a significant voice, even for a short period of time, is in something like Pause for Thought. And Dave Tomlinson was reflecting a bit about his experience of Pause for Thought. Also, just wonder how you approach. You have this huge audience and a couple of minutes to say something when people are doing the school run or in the car on their way to work. How do you approach that as a comedian, as a writer, as a Christian? How does that whole thing work for you? What's going on there?
Well, it's funny to say that. I actually I run a couple of podcasts, because doesn't everyone nowadays, you can't move for podcasts, and I interviewed a woman called Kathy Madavan, who's an author and a speaker, yesterday for my podcast, and we were talking about that exact thing, because she does the Pause for Thought thing. She does the middle of the night slot, which they record at 11:30 at night, and then it's edited and broadcast sort of as live at 2:45 in the morning, and I've done a couple of those, and I also do the 9:20 slot, which is live on Zoe Ball's show. And she was saying, "Oh yeah, I get all the sort of truckers and insomniacs, So she said, all of my Pause for Thoughts are just trying to be positive and funny or fun, just keep them awake, really, But she said, unlike yours with Zoe, And I said, the thing is with the Zoe slot, though, I think that a large part of most of your audience, in fact, aren't really listening. They're kind of, you're in the background while they're getting breakfast ready or doing the school run. Middle of the night, maybe you've got a captive audience with the truckers and the road workers, I don't know. But it is something I often think about: who's listening, where are they at, what sort of people, where they're at in their lives. You can't assume anything really about prior knowledge of faith backgrounds necessarily, or what they're doing. There's no point starting a Pause for Thought going, well, as and you know what children have been like during this pandemic and homeschooling. You think, well, no, many people listening don't have kids, or don't, everyone's got very different environments. So you have to approach it, I think, meet people where they are a little. And I try and also aim it, I think everyone has a different way of approaching it, but I try and write mine aiming at someone who thinks they've made their mind up about Christianity and religion as a whole and thinks it's not for them. So I'm not trying to convert people particularly. I'm not trying to proselytize, but I am trying to say there's something in this that maybe you've not realized, or there's some wisdom in this that even if you, at the end of the pause for thought, you still go, you know what, that faith thing is not for me. But if it can just make people go, actually though, that Jesus, he did say some good things, and in fact there's a bit of wisdom in that, and I could live my life by that, and I could do that I could apply this to my life. I could forgive more readily. I could not go pointing out the plank in my neighbour's eye sort of thing until I can work out, the speck in my neighbour's eye until I get the plank out my own, whatever it might be. I constantly come back to like Jesus, his parables are all, well, they're little sitcoms in a way, they're little mini comedy stories sometimes that meets people where they are, and when he's talking about specks of dust and sawdust and planks in eyes, he's from a carpentry background. His dad's a carpenter. He speaks to fishermen disciples about fish and catching fish, and he speaks to farmers about scattering seed and all that sort of thing. And I wonder if to some degree, that the way that the Christian faith in the Bible was maybe more easily communicated 200 years ago, and partly it's because, of course, pre-Enlightenment and pre-Dawkins and pre-industrialization and things like that. But also, I think back then we had more labouring jobs. Most people, people were farmers and fishers and carpenters and worked with their hands. And nowadays, there aren't any parables about IT consultants and things like that. Tax collectors, that's still going, but some jobs never go away. But yeah, it's just trying to meet people. I suppose that's what Jesus did. I think meeting people where they are and his audience where they were, and that's, I suppose, what we're trying to do. Something like that,
Sure. I'm going to come back to another pause for thought question in a minute, but before I get lost within this, Peter asks, does your humour translate into other cultures? So,
well, you'll have to ask them probably.
Have you done much sort of travelling with?
I've done a bit, not for a year at least, but no, certainly early on. I mean, since I got married and had kids, I've done a bit less travelling. But early on, as a carefree bachelor who didn't answer to anyone, I did a few gigs, especially across Europe. Germany's got actually quite a strong stand-up circuit. Done quite a few gigs in Germany. South of France, lovely gigs in Monte Carlo and things like that. But the thing is, mostly expat gigs. I did Bahrain once. I did a gig in Bahrain. They didn't even pay for accommodation. They flew us out there, 10 hours off the plane. You do the gig, you fly 10 hours home. I sort of left home on Wednesday, arrived back on Friday. I hadn't slept, but they're all, yeah. I mean, stand-up comedy as a thing, I think, is quite British, it seems. And generally speaking, when I've just found it across in other countries, comedy clubs they have there seem to stem out either of an expat community of Brits, Americans, Australians, but English language anyway. I did do a German language comedy club where I had to be translated and things, but they're all of their acts were quite different. There's more clowning and things like that, or some musical comedy. But in terms of kind of straight stand up, it does seem to do quite a cultural thing of English language sort of speaking countries, really. And but in terms of the culture thing, though, Monte Carlo, in English speaking audience, but in terms of finding common ground there was tough, because you're looking out of this big window of this bar and you could see the marina where all of the super yachts were parked, and the audience all owned those yachts, and as a compare, I was there going, so what do you do for a living? You don't want to tell me. So, okay, fine, because you've not, it's something tax dodgy, or you've not worked, he's like a billionaire, and I'm there doing jokes about Lidl or Asda, and there's not a lot of crossover. So it was, they were tricky.
So coming back to a couple of things which you said, you talked about Jesus and parables, and I guess some of the best pause for thoughts, and probably some of the best sermons I've ever heard have always been people who are good storytellers. I think that's always just the connection with people. But do you think Jesus was funny, or do you think God's funny?
Yeah, I think when I read a quote last week, again in the Radio Times, I think, Well, apparently it said to me like, isn't it funny how all the best stories happen to the best storytellers or something like that? It's, but basically we've all got some good stories. It's, but if you can work on telling it properly, then you can leap off the page, don't they? But I think, well, as I said, I think the way that Jesus meeting his audience where they are, I think, and using the parables is use of comedy, really. And we don't laugh out loud particularly, but then it's a different language, it's been translated, and we don't laugh now at a Shakespeare comedy. That was 500 years ago, let alone 2000 years ago. Comedy from, I'm doing a big project at the minute about the start of the BBC and the start of broadcasting 100 years ago, and the early radio shows. And you listen to the early radio comedy, and I can't quite fathom what's funny in it particularly. I can hear it's sort of jolly, but tastes in humor change, tastes in comedy change. And I think the way that Jesus was using parables is comedy. I think he's making and if they're laughing, they're listening. So that's that plank of wood metaphor is it's an extreme caricature kind of your life kind of thing. And so I think there's comedy there, and by Jesus being who he is, fully God but fully human, meeting us where we are, there's that earthy mentality to it. We're salt and light, salt the earth kind of thing. And I think there's by being human, the human condition itself is funny. I mean, in terms of the grand scale of life and all that, they say it's either a tragedy or a comedy, and a tragedy has a sad ending and a comedy has a happy ending. And as Christians, we believe that life has the happy ending. So I think life is a comedy. It's got moments of tragedy in it, certainly, but I think overall, I think when there's another great quote from Charlie Chaplin, I think it is, who says, I've got it here, life is a tragedy you've seen in close up, but a comedy in long shot. And that idea that if you zoom out, you can appreciate the comedy. And it's when you're close up that you don't see it. The similar take at Mel Brooks said, tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die. Which is a little harsh, but I think you get the idea that you can zoom in and see the tragedy, but you can zoom out and appreciate the broad canvas of life and all its comedy. And I think that's the God's eye view. The God's eye view of the world is the wide shot, of course. But I think what's great about the Christian story is that God is also there in the close-up tragedy of our lives. And he's there for that, by Jesus being who he is, he's there for the tragedy. He's been there. He's been through the cross. The death and resurrection means that he knows the tragedy and has felt it, as well as being the creator's wide shot view that sees life with all of its humor and laughs and loves and joys. So, yeah.
Well, we've sort of got a few minutes left. And one of the things we've not touched upon particularly is your writing, and you've got various books, and I think you've got one coming out. Well, according to Amazon, the research that I've done today, you've got a book coming out quite soon with Ruth Valerio. And,
that's right. Next month.
Tell us a bit of a plug for that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the new one is called Planet Protectors, and it's aimed at children. I should know the age group it's aimed at. It changes all the time. I think it's sort of 8 to 11-year-olds, the sort of age group. And that was an idea that came to me via Ruth, because if you know Ruth, she's done lots of great writing and speaking about the environment and how we should look after the planet. And she wanted to do a version of one of her books, but more aimed at children, because the Greta Thunberg effect. And my kids are talking all the time about, they're leading the way really in terms of the how we should be living our lives. So she wanted to write something for children, and she knew I'd written for children, and I'm on a journey in terms of the environment work. We don't do bad. I'm not Ruth Valerio levels. If you know Ruth, she's everything's homegrown, and there's not a bit of plastic within 5 miles of her house. Whereas I can tell you this, right? So last summer we're writing the book. We're going back and forth. We've obviously been a pandemic going on, so we've been doing it remotely. And I owed Ruth like the last chapter, but it was like August, and we're going on holiday down in Cornwall. So I was like, I'll get you it within the week, sort of thing. I didn't tell her I'm going off to Cornwall. And we went down to Cornwall, and right at the tip of the peninsula of the country, not Land's End, but it was St Mawes Castle, right on the tip of the coast. And we walked around the corner and bumped into Ruth Valerio with her teenage daughters. She's having a holiday down there as well, of all the places to bump into her. But worst of all, A, I hadn't told her that I was doing the holiday in Oda this chapter, but B, for the only time in the entire week, my wife and I, we got the kids there, we'd had a bit of a tough morning, and there was a coffee shop, and we're like, let's have a coffee. Single-use plastic coffee cups. And we'd just written a chat about how that is awful. You should, you get your, refill your reusables, and just bumped into a girl. Busted, totally busted. And in fact, I was looking for the bin. 3 seconds later, I'd have got them in the bin. She would never have seen it. But yeah, so that's a good book that I've really enjoyed doing. 52 Ways to Look After God's Planet, and really encouraging and equipping children, hopefully, to do that sort of thing. Because in the past, I've done, well, the books I've got. This is the or junior children. This is Noah's Car Park Ark, and sort of rhyming picture books that I've done for sort of 5 to 8 year olds. And that's really my route into working with Ruth, based on those. And then, I did a memoir called So a Comedian Walks Into a Church. That was the first book I did, 2013, which I think when we first met, probably. Did a book on the history of Christmas. And I mean, I went to a writing conference a few years ago that said you should really just pick one type of book and, write just for children, or write just history books. I've done history, memoir, joke book, children of different ages. And now I'm also writing a novel. So I can't pick a lane. I mean, as you can tell from this interview, I'm writing sitcoms, doing stand-up, doing radio. I just can't decide what to do. I just like a bit of everything. 12 jobs. That's where I'm happiest. Do all 12 at once. One-man band.
Fantastic. Well, final thing. I'll give you opportunity for a good plug here. You've written about Christmas. We've talked about the sacred, secular. We've covered quite a lot of ground. And it's May, so we should probably talk about Christmas. Tell us about comedians and carols, because I think we should have you one day down for that. But tell us a bit about how that came up and how that works.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's my favourite time of year, Christmas. Love it. Literally wrote the book on it. Did I mention that? I think I did. I did a Christmas podcast a few years ago. I'm a complete Christmas nut, and but at Christmas time, what ruined Christmas for me on the stand-up circuit was that the Christmas gigs were horrible. They're the worst gigs of the year, because it's all office parties. It's like 90 plumbers. And I have no offense to the plumbers, but it was one of the worst gigs I've ever done, because one of those plumbers wanted to go to comedy and booked it, and the other 89 just wanted karaoke or a nightclub or something like that. And so it's just like crowd control, So I started doing a few church events, and I pitched to my local church. I said, how about we do a one-off show called 9 Comedians and Carols? Instead of 9 Lessons in Carols, I'll book 9 different comedians to do a set loosely based on that Bible reading, and we'll have a version of the Christmas story told by comedians. And we did it, but 9 comedians, it turns out that took about 4 hours to get through, and people missed the last train home and everything. So now we just do Comedians in Carols, which is normally about 3 or so comedians, but increasingly I've done it for like 12 years now, so I've now built up I do lots of sort of funny versions of carols and different takes on the nativity story. So the last few years, I've been often just doing it as me, comedy and carols, just one person, and having lots of sing-song moments, and lots of we do our little town of Bethlehem to the tune of the Benny Hill theme, and works very well. Silent Night to the tune of Postman Pat was our newest discovery. That was good fun. You can try it home tonight if you like. But so I'm a big fan of all, anything like that. I'd have Christmas all year if I could, probably. But although I'm well aware I have to rein it in, because my kids said to me a couple of years ago, my daughter, when she was 5, because I was going on about, for the book, I was, do you know the history of the Christmas cracker? Do you know that Charles Dickens's first 8 Christmases were white Christmases, which is why I wrote about snow? And my daughter, who's 5, said, Daddy, I think you've ruined Christmas. Because I just was talking about it too much. So I have to Grinchify myself now and rein it in a bit. But
brilliant. Well, we are about out of time, but thank you, Paul, so much for joining us. Like I say, we've covered a significant amount of ground, as stuff for us to reflect on. I hope well, you'll be down the road in a few months' time, but hopefully we might be able to have you come visit us another time.
Love to, absolutely. Well, I'm so much looking forward to a live event again. I'll be there early. I think I'm going to go and camp out and just get ready for this live gig early on. So, and thank you for bearing with my dropout earlier as well, by the way. And I don't know how many jokes you managed to get through while filling time, but
I mean, I'm quite an expert in this this field, as I'm sure you know. But please do check out Paul's books as well. Like I say, there's lots of different ones, and the new one coming out. And then our guests over the next couple of weeks, or in 2 weeks' time, we've got Hilary Bond, who would be a great pal of Ruth Valerio and tell Paul why he's terrible for having a single-use coffee cup, but will give us all kinds of interesting insights into the environment. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. And,
thank you. You're very nice to see you. And as I said, you're very welcome. Monday lunchtimes on my Facebook page. Half an hour of fun and games. Just. If you fancy, if not, but nice to, we'll see you at some point, live and in person, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. An enlightening hour.
Thank you.